There once was a mommy otter and a daddy otter. The two otters got together and decided to make a baby otter. And another, and another, and another, until eventually there was a whole army of baby otters. Wait a second, let me rewind just a little bit and explain how we got here. Today, I'm going to tell you everything that you need to know about breeding in Ark from a beginner's perspective. Today's video is meant to be an introduction to breeding, and hopefully it will answer all the questions that you may have, whether you are new to Ark, need a refresher, or simply never dived into breeding. I'm going to divide this video up into three main sections: an introduction, breeding, and mutations. Then within those sections, there will be smaller sections that are going to have timestamps that you can kind of jump around to, or you can just watch it the whole way through. And of course, you can also go back to the things that you may feel that you need to watch again. Now, I have previously made a mutation breeding guide before, and you may have already seen it. If not, I'm going to link it up above and link it in the description of the video. I really encourage you to only watch that after you've watched this, unless you're very familiar with breeding in Ark already. That guide is definitely a more advanced one, and I got a lot of comments from people feeling really overwhelmed by all the information in it, so that's why we're kind of making a prequel to that video here today. So if you do find this one useful, please make sure you hit the like button and consider subscribing if you're new here. We're so close to hitting 10K, and I would love for you to be a part of that journey. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the introduction of breeding in Ark. The first thing we need to talk about: what is breeding in Ark? Breeding in Ark is when you take two creatures and, well, make a baby. Almost all creatures require a male and a female to breed. However, some, like snails, don't have a gender and can breed with each other despite having no gender. Why do you want to even breed in Ark? Is there a reason to do this? The answer is yes. There are four main reasons to breed in Ark. The first is imprinting. Baby dinos, including those taken from the wild, have the ability to be imprinted. An imprint is basically like a bond with a player. This mechanic allows fully imprinted babies to receive a 20% boost to their stats. It also provides a 30% damage or resistance buff when ridden by the player they are imprinted to. You can see who is imprinted to a creature by going into its inventory, and in the center of the screen, it will say raised by so-and-so. If you're playing without mods, you'll have to manually imprint the baby dino through a variety of means. When it is ready to be imprinted, it will ask for one of several different actions, including walking a certain distance, cuddling, or even feeding it something at once. The number of imprints it requires to get 100% varies depending on the creature and your server settings. The second reason to breed in Ark is replacements. If you tend to lose your creatures a lot, especially in the early days of a new map, having replacement creatures is really important. The easiest way to replace a dead creature is to use its baby. So what I usually tend to do is, after I start a new map, I will tame a breeding pair of whatever creature that I'm using, and then that way I will have a baby from them that I can use in the event that my creature dies. This is a lot easier than having to go out and tame a new one. Third, stats. The stats of dinos are important. Dinos in Ark typically have 6 stats that affect them: health, stamina, oxygen, food, weight, and melee. The more health a dino has, the longer it can survive in a fight, and the more melee a dino has, the faster it can kill things. If we can understand how stats work in breeding, it's easier to make better dinos. There's going to be more on this in the next section, so stay tuned. Finally, mutations. Mutations are a more advanced form of breeding in Ark. Basically, when you breed two dinos together, you have a small chance of getting a mutation, which can make a dino stat better or give you a cool color. The more mutations you have, the stronger your dino usually becomes. As I mentioned, I have a guide on this already, and I recommend watching it after this video to understand how mutation breeding works. I'll explain more about mutations in simple terms later on as well, but for now, you just need to know that they can affect the stats and the colors of your dinos and make them stronger. So, how do stats work in Ark? For the most part, every creature comes with health, stamina, oxygen, food, weight, and melee. Some creatures will have different terms for these stats, such as light pets, which have things like regen. However, a creature's level is determined by how many points are put into each stat. And different creatures of the same level can have a different distribution of points into different stats. For example, you can see the stats of 3 otters on my screen. I spawned these otters in just to use them for comparison, which is why they are level 225. But if you were to perfect tame a wild 150 otter, their level would be 224. As you can see, they all have different amounts into their different stats. I'm using Dino Depot to see the point distribution for each of the 3 otters. The first column you see is the otter's base points into each of the stats. The second column is mutation points, and the third column are the points that are put into levels. If you add up all of the base points, it will come out to 224. This point distribution is why you and your friend may have both tamed level 150 Ankies, but one of you gets more resources when harvesting than the other. Because despite the same level, the points into each stat are randomly distributed. So what stats are good stats? Deciding what stats you want to focus on when it comes to breeding depends on the dino. Most dinos do not need a high oxygen or food stat, so having low stats in these categories is ideal. However, some creatures like Daedons do benefit from having more points into food. It just depends on the creature that you are raising or breeding. The basic rule to follow for most dinos would be farming dinos usually need melee and weight, fighting dinos need more points into HP and melee, and supporting dinos like the snow owl need more points into stamina so that they can heal longer. It just depends on the creatures and their intended purpose. Does leveling a creature affect the breeding or the babies? No, regardless of how many points you put into a certain stat when you are leveling the creature, the baby can only come out with one of the parent's base stats, not the stats after leveling or imprinting. So what creatures should I even consider taming before breeding? There's two different ways to answer this question. If you simply want to breed your best stats together and call it a day, you'll want to tame several high-level dinos and then compare their stats. If you intend to breed for mutations, the answer is a bit more complicated. In ASA, you can transfer mutations. What I mean by that is you can tame 2 low-level Rexes and begin mutation breeding with those. You can later transfer the mutation stacks to a higher statted Rex. For example, you start with a base melee of 10 points. You breed that until you have 100 mutations on that base melee. You later get lucky and tame a Rex with 50 points into melee. You can then breed that mutated Rex to the 50-point Rex, and eventually a baby will pop out that has 50 points into melee and 100 mutations. Now, what is ancestry? We're going to talk a little bit more about this in regards to mutations later on, but it is important to understand that ancestry exists and how to view it. Bred creatures have a family lineage called ancestry, which is basically a history of the creature's family. You can see this by going into the inventory of a dino and at the bottom clicking on Show Ancestors. If the creature is wild-caught, you won't see any family history. However, on bred creatures, you will see who their parents were. You can also see mutations. We'll talk about this more later, as understanding the screen when it comes to mutation breeding is really important. But for now, this is where you can see ancestry of a dino. Moving into the second big section of this video, we're going to talk about breeding in general. At the end of the day, the goal of breeding is to just simply make a better dino. Whether that's by imprinting, combining the best stats, mutating, or all three of those things. So I've already explained about how to imprint on babies. This next section will focus on combining stats and basic breeding practices. When it comes to breeding, there are certain conditions that need to be met depending on the dino. Certain creatures need certain conditions, such as water dinos need to be in the water, not only to breed, but also usually to have their babies. If you try to take them out onto land, or if you try to throw the baby out on land, it will either die and go poof, or you just simply won't be able to. There are 2 types of babies in Ark, those that are bred from gestation, which are typically mammals, and those bred from incubation. These would be your egg layers. Gestating babies are carried inside of their mother until they are ready to be born, and the overall conditions around the parent don't matter too much. Incubation, on the other hand, depends on the temperature of the area around the egg. Different eggs need different temperatures in order to incubate, and the best practice for hatching eggs is to simply have a lot of air conditioners in your hatching area. You may need to add more depending on what you are hatching, and you can see if an egg is incubating by looking at it. It will say if it's too hot, too cold, or just right. Now, when you're breeding, oftentimes you might run into a situation where you're breeding 2 parents and the baby comes out a lower level than its parents or a higher level than its parents. Why is this? Babies have the chance of taking either of the parents' stats. So let's compare Otter A and Otter C. The baby of these 2 could have any combination of these stats. Even though both parents are level 225, their baby could come out lower than 225 or higher depending on if they get the higher or lower stats, or they could come out at 225 if they duplicate one of the parents. As I mentioned previously, the way that stats work in this game is that the total number of points that a creature has determines its level. Now, if the baby takes the health from this one and the melee from that one, the oxygen from this one, the food from that one, it's going to mix up the stats. And that means those base points are also going to be different. And like I said, the combination of all the base points determines the level of the baby. So that's why sometimes your baby may actually end up a lower level or a higher level than the parents if you're breeding 2 parents that do not have the same stats. Now let's talk about combining stats. So you've decided you want to breed your otter that has 39 points into health, 41 points into weight, and 41 points to melee. However, those points are on 3 different otters. You need to combine them by breeding until you get the stats together on the same otter. Let's start with health and melee. We're going to breed these two together until they make a baby that has both of those stats. Now with that baby, you're going to breed it back to the one that has high weight until you get all 3 of those stats on the same otter. That's how you combine the stats of creatures to put them all onto the same one. The same thing would work if you're trying to lower the stats of a creature. You would just breed it to the one with the lower stat until you get the stats that you want on the baby of your choice. What is a perfect breeding pair? A perfect breeding pair is 2 identical creatures with identical stats and thus identical levels with no mutations. These 2 will always produce identical copies of themselves. The only time you will see a difference in the baby's level will be if you have a new mutation. How many males and females should I be using for breeding? The more breeders you have, the easier it is to get the results you want. Breeding is a random numbers game. Your odds go up the more you put in, and they go down the less you put in. If you're only breeding 1 male and 1 female, the chances of getting the stats you want or even new mutations is significantly lower than if you're breeding 1 male with 20 or even 30 females. The more females, the higher the odds to get your desired results. What's also important to note is if you're breeding either gestation or incubation creatures. Gestation creatures, you have to wait until that female gives birth before you can breed her again. However, with incubation creatures, the breeding tends to go a lot faster because once the female pops out an egg, she'll be ready to breed again much faster because the time to actually produce the egg is much shorter. It's just much easier to collect eggs than it is to gestate. So keep that in mind when you're deciding how many females you should be using, because at the end of the day, the more numbers you have, the faster it's going to go, regardless of whether you're gestating or incubating. Now, the last section for this is traits. There are traits that can make it easier to breed for the specific stat that you want. For this section of the guide, we're going to talk about frail and robust traits. There are 3 different tiers of traits, and you can use traits using the gene scanner, which is a part of Bob's Tall Tales. Robust traits increase the probability that a baby of the creature with the trait will inherit the higher of its parent's stats for the trait applied by the probability of 1.5% for Tier 1, 2.25% for Tier 2, and 3% for Tier 3. So if you have a creature with melee robust on, and it is a Tier 3 trait, you're going to have a 3% higher chance of having that baby pop out with a higher melee stat than the lower melee stat. The frail traits, on the other hand, do the exact opposite by decreasing the probability that a baby will inherit the higher of its parent's stats by 1.5%, 2.25%, and 3%. Robust traits are really useful when you're trying to combine or improve the chances of getting a higher stat on the baby, and frail traits are really good for lowering the stats you don't want, such as oxygen or food. Moving on to the final section, which is mutations. So what are mutations? Mutations are a random occurrence that happen while breeding 2 dinos together. Each new mutation comes with 2 parts, a color and a stat. The stat mutation will attach itself to one of the stats, such as health, melee, stamina, food, weight, or oxygen. It also adds points to the stat it mutated, as seen on this otter. It has 1 mutation, but there are 2 points into the stat. The second part of the mutation is the color mutation. This will apply itself to one of the 6 color regions on a dino. Unfortunately, not all dinos show all 6 color regions, so that means there's a chance that the color won't show on some creatures, depending on the region the mutation goes on to. Now, how do I tell if a baby has a mutation? There are a few different ways to tell if a baby has a mutation, depending on if you're using mods or how you did your breeding line. The easiest way is to see the baby's ancestry. All mutations will show up there. For example, if you're breeding 2 0 mutation parents, the baby will have a 1 out of 20 on either the mother or the father's side. If the father has 2 mutations already and the mother 0, the baby will appear as having 3 mutations, and either 3 out of 20 and 0 out of 20, or 2 out of 20 and 1 out of 20, depending on what side the mutation went on to. That is the simplest way in order to see if a baby has new mutations. The second way to do it on vanilla without using any mods is to look at the parent's base stats. What I used to do back in ASE is I would look at the parent's stats and say, this parent has, 320 melee, this one has 420 melee, and if the baby comes out with a higher stat on either one of those, then you know that it's mutated. The third way to see if a baby has a mutation is by using a mod, such as Dino Depot. It makes it very clear and very easy to see. Now, I want to just go back very quickly to the second option, which is looking at the baby's stat, or specifically their levels when they come out as well. If you're breeding a perfect pair or from a perfect pair line, every single baby will come out with 2 more levels. That means if you breed two 225 creatures, their baby with a mutation is going to be 227, but only if they're a perfect pair. If they're not a perfect pair, that mutation number is going to go on to something. However, it's going to be all over the place. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a section a little bit further down from now. But it's just important to know that if you choose not to breed with a perfect breeding pair, using level to determine if you've gotten a new mutation is much more difficult. And I really encourage you to try to use a perfect breeding pair because it makes it so much easier. Like I said, we're going to talk about this, but that is another way to tell if a baby has a mutation. So what is the best way to breed for mutations? In simple terms, you want to start with a perfect breeding pair, which has the exact same stats. It's best to use at least 20 to 30 females, so 1 male, 20 to 30 females, all the exact same. For this example, the level of these perfect pair otters is 244. I know because they are exactly the same that a baby with a new mutation will come out as a level 246. Every new mutation will add 2 levels to the baby. You can also see it here using Dino Depot in the red column. You'll then take the male baby and breed him back to the base stat females. You'll know that you have another new mutation when that baby is level 248. But keep in mind that any new mutation can go into any stat, not just the one that you want. So that 248 baby could have a mutation into health. It could have also have a mutation into melee, oxygen, food, weight, stamina, all of those things. Now, moving on, what are the odds for mutations? The odds of a mutation when both parents are under 20 mutations are 1 mutation, 7.31%, 2 mutations equals 0.18%, 3 mutations is 0.0015%. And yes, this means that babies can be born with more than 1 mutation at a time. As you can see on my screen, this particular baby actually got a double stacked mutation, so it had 2 existing mutations, but it decided it was going to throw 2 more mutations onto food. And that is something that can happen. It can happen up to 3 times as long as both of the parents are under 20 mutations. However, what's also important to know is that these mutations can go anywhere. You could get 1 into health, 1 into melee, 1 into oxygen. And this is why it's really important not to use those particular babies in the breeding because of the example that I just showed you in terms of the different options of babies that you could get. It just gets really messy and it ends up messing up with your ancestry and your out of 20. Now, do mutations stop after 20 out of 20? This is a question I actually get a lot, and a lot of people don't really understand what I mean by this. And no, they don't stop after 20 out of 20 as long as one parent is still below 20 out of 20. Once both parents are over 20 out of 20, then you can no longer get new mutations. However, if only one parent has reached this, you can continue breeding for mutations. It just decreases your likelihood of getting a new mutation. Now, why should I use 0 mutation females for mutation breeding? This is probably the most important thing that I can explain, and I'm going to try and do it both mathematically and also visually to make it something that people can understand very easily. If I mess up the math, I am so sorry. I am really trying here. It's super complicated with the numbers and trying to use these examples, but hopefully this will make it very easy for you to see and understand why I recommend this. When you start bringing in a variety of numbers, that increases the options for the RNG to select from. It also very quickly takes you out of the 20 out of 20 on the male side, and that means your odds for new mutations go down. Now let me show you 3 different examples of how things look when you're breeding a male with either base females, which are 0 mutations, or with females with mutations. The first example we're going to look at is a male and a female, which are a perfect breeding pair. They have 0 mutations, so we can see the base stats here, which is 47, 39, 45, 30, 41, 41. If you breed those 2 together and they don't get any mutation, the baby can only have these stats. If both parents have the exact same stats, the baby can only have the exact same stats as long as it doesn't have a new mutation. However, if the baby does get 1 new mutation, the mutation can go into any of these stats. It can go into 47 and become 49, 39 and become 41, 45 and become 47, 30 and become 32, weight could be 43 instead, or melee could also be 43. So this is 2 base stat breeders, a male and a female. This is the only combination of babies that they can have, either no mutation or 1 mutation if we're talking about 1 mutation. This whole example here, we're only going to be talking about 1 new mutation, but there is the possibility to get more than 1. we're just using one just to keep things simple. Now, let's move on to example number 2. Dad has one mutation, and the females are all base. His babies have a couple different options that they could be. They could come out an exact copy of the mother. They could come out an exact copy of the father. They could come out a copy of the father or a mutation into any of the other stats. What I mean by that is it doesn't always guarantee that the mutation is going to carry over. So you could actually take that health mutation and it could go away in the breeding line, but you could get a new mutation in its place. All right, now let's take a look at what happens if we have a male and a female with one mutation on each side and all of their possible babies with a new mutation. So the first option that you could get would be simply that you would copy the base stats and that new mutation could actually go onto any of them. So option 1 with a new mutation means that that new mutation could go onto any stat. It could go into health, stamina, oxygen, food, weight, or melee. It could potentially not even go onto one of the existing mutations. It could go onto one of the other stats. You may not even get the male or the female mutation to carry over to the baby. So for example, as was previously shown, with no mutation, sometimes you can get just the male mutation to carry over or just the female mutation to carry over. But then with this new mutation, that complicates things by adding in the ability for that stat to not carry over, but a new mutation to be achieved. And it just compounds that, and it just grows and it kind of snowballs. The other option would be that the male stats carry over and we get a new mutation either on health, so that would be 51 points into health, or we could get 49 points into health with a mutation into stamina, oxygen, food, weight, or melee. Vice versa, the mutation from the female could carry over, and that mutation could then go on to health, stamina, oxygen, food, or weight. And then the final kind of option that we could end up with here would be that both parents' mutations carry over. So we have 49 points into health and 43 points into melee, but then that mutation could go onto any of the other stats again, which would be 51 points into health, or it could be 41 points into stamina, or 47 points into oxygen, 32 points into food, weight 43, and melee 45. But it can only go into one of those categories. So it could bring over all of the parent stats. It could bring over one of the parent stats. It could bring over none of the stats and simply be the base. You can see how big this number gets. And it's just simply a waste of your time and energy. Not only that, but the baby, no matter what, is going to be carrying 3 mutations with it versus 2. So what I mean by that is even if you get it to stack on the health, so you get the parent's health mutation, plus the baby gets a health mutation and it stacks, that baby, if the mother also has a mutation, is going to end up in its ancestry showing 3 mutations rather than 2. Even if the melee mutation does not actually carry over to the baby, the ancestry will still show it. I'm going to explain this a little bit more later on, how the whole ancestry thing works and how messy it can get very quickly with that. But this is kind of, I think, the best way I can try to explain it right now. Hopefully the visual has helped. But yeah, that's why it just gets, there's too many options when you're starting to add in multiple mutation lines into the babies, and it just tends to snowball. And then imagine you're breeding back more mutations later on, and it just gets really messy. It turns into a giant ball of spaghetti, man. It's just not worth it. So, should I keep mutated dinos? I recommend keeping your color mutations. What I like to do is I like to have my breeders in one area of my base, and then I will keep really cool colored mutations that I see during that whole breeding process, and I kind of just put them in a box to the side until I'm ready to start combining them. And then on the side, I will combine those into the color creature that I want. And once I finish mutating the dinosaurs for stats, I will then combine the colors and the stat mutations and breed those together. Now, how do mutations stack in Ancestry? This is another part that I think people really struggle with, and I'm going to try and simplify it as much as possible here. As mentioned earlier, you can see a dino's ancestry by going to Show Ancestors in their inventory. The number here that's important is in the top of both sides of the lineage. This number is the sum of all the dino's ancestors' mutations. Whether they visibly show that mutation on the creature or not, that number simply adds over and over and over again. It's not how many mutations are visible on a dino, it is simply just that history of the entire line. Let me try to explain a little bit better. If you have a baby that has been bred cleanly without crossing in female breeders with mutations and only running the mutations through the male line with 0 out of 20 females, your baby's ancestry will accurately reflect the number of mutations. So say that baby has 10 health mutations. In its ancestry, it'll eventually show as 10 out of 20. It's really important to pay attention to this because it's very easy to go over that 20 out of 20 if you're not paying attention to these extra mutations that you could be getting while breeding. Is there a cap to mutations or levels? Technically, yes. Official servers have a level cap of 450. That means you won't be able to have creatures over that level. Mutations are also capped. The max amount of mutations that you can get is 254, which is 127 mutations into one stat. All right, so that means you can only have that many mutations on each stat. Remember what I said earlier, that levels are determined by the combination of all the stats of a dino. So if your creature has 50 points into each of their stats, their level is already going to be 300. Combine that with the fact that you can only typically put 88 levels into a tame dino through leveling, that means you'll be limited by how many mutations you can put onto that dino. Now, this is where the topic of lowering unwanted stats comes in. If you decide that you want to do 127 mutations into health and 127 mutations into melee, the only way to really and effectively do that is by lowering other stats to make room for those new mutations. By lowering these unwanted stats, such as maybe food or weight, and reducing them as low as you can, ideally 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points into those categories by using low-level wild creatures, you've now freed up an additional amount of points that can be put into mutation. Well, here we are. We've made it through all of this incredibly complicated information. I really hope that I have simplified it and made it easy to understand for you. And if you have stuck with me to the end, here is a glossary of all of the terms that I have mentioned throughout this video. And if there's something that you're not really sure about, feel free to ask me in the comments. I am more than happy to answer. But hopefully you enjoyed this one. Hopefully you found it useful. And if you did, consider subscribing. And of course, also hit the like button. And if you have the ability to hype the video, I actually completely forgot about this because I haven't had the option to do this, but I would also really like it if you hyped the video up. That would be absolutely wonderful. But if this has not terrorized you and you're not completely overwhelmed by it, do consider also checking out my specific guide for mutation breeding. I think this is a really good introduction to mutations, and it answers some of the questions that I may have skipped in that other video, simply because I went into that video assuming people already knew about breeding in general and all of these different things, and I just kind of went straight in for mutation breeding, and I later found out that a lot of people were really overwhelmed by that. So hopefully this brings things back. I know there's a lot of math in it, and hopefully y'all are not absolutely brain melted at this point. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and if you did, like I said, hit the like button, subscribe if you're new here, and hopefully I will catch you in the next one. Bye!